Thank you. Thanks, Todd. Wow. It's a real pleasure to be here. You can hear me okay back there? Yeah. It's funny how life happens, and you do things that you had no intention of doing, and you think about things in detail, and it doesn't make any difference what you decide. And you do the slightest little gesture, and off goes your life. And after I got out of the Army in 1967, I went to Santa Barbara and studied anthropology, and got a BA in anthropology, and I wanted to go study with Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict at Columbia. And so I applied to Columbia, and I was getting the GI Bill then, which was $100 a month, which is not enough. And so I applied for all the fellowships, checked all the boxes, and there was one called the National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship. It required the study of a rare language, in 1970, a rare language, and for a Westerner. And I just read a book by Alan Watts called The Way of Zen, and it made such wonderful sense, and it had these Chinese characters in it, so I wrote in the word Chinese. And so here I am tonight. And so I went to Columbia, and I met a monk in Chinatown, and he taught me how to meditate. And I thought, this is much better than studying for a PhD. So I quit after 2 years of Columbia. I left and went to live in a monastery in Taiwan. One of the classmates at Columbia had been to Taiwan. And so that's where my acquaintance with Chinese really began, because in a monastery you actually don't learn much spoken Chinese. But after a couple of years, the abbot gave me a book of poems that he had published. Not his poems, but the poems of Han Shan, or Cold Mountain. And he had pirated Burton Watson's English translations of 1/3 of the poems. So I could see how a famous translator had worked using the Chinese and then rendering it in English. And then I started translating as an exercise to improve my Chinese. And I fell in love with the art of translation. Not many people, really, we don't really ever think about language and what language actually does. And we definitely don't think about what translation does. I've published about 2,000 poems now in translation, and I'm just beginning to get a sense for what translation does. I tell people it's like I see a beautiful woman dancing on the dance floor, and I want to dance with her, but I'm deaf. I have no idea what's motivating her dance. I just see the result. And so I try to accompany her. I try to get close. But I don't get so close that I put my English feet on top of her Chinese feet, which was a lot of people think that's a literal, accurate translation. Of course, it kills the dance. And you can't dance across the room either. And so this is how I've been working over the years, is trying to get close to my dance partners and find out, learn from them how they're dancing. And it's led me to also the belief that, I don't even know why I'm talking about this, because I'm going to show you slides about hermits, but Todd was talking about the poetry, and I thought I would just explain this just a minute, because I'm going to read a few poems at the end tonight. Is that I've discovered that the poem on the page isn't the real poem. The real poem, in fact, the original meaning of the Chinese character for poetry is words from the heart. The Chinese, the most famous Han Dynasty commentator on poetry said, 在心为志, 法言为诗. When it's in the heart, it's meaning. When it's put into language, then it's poetry. And so it's the heart that comes out into poetry, and the Chinese character means words from the heart. And so this has sort of motivated me all these years, is to keep doing this, is because I love to dance with these people that I have wrote this beautiful stuff. I would never write my own poetry. I need someone to dance with. So anyway, I thought I would mention that right now just to get that out of the way, because that's how I really got into Chinese, is in the monastery. I'd meditate, take walks, but I'd also translate. And so after I moved out of the monastery, after 4 years, the abbot said, you've been here, almost 4 years. Isn't it time you became a monk? And, I'd been freeloading, and I felt embarrassed about that, so I left soon after that, and then moved to this farming village outside of Taipei on this mountain, and really started translating. And that's when I started publishing the works that I was doing. I ran into a publisher and then published my stuff. And so I've been doing that now for, I guess since, 36, 37 years now. But the first people I translated were these hermits, Han Shan, Cold Mountain, to whom Jack Kerouac dedicated the Dharma Bums. And the ancient edition I had of Cold Mountain's poetry, not the one that Abbott gave me, but a Qing Dynasty edition. After Cold Mountain's poems, some editor had put the poems of a man named Stonehouse. And I thought, wow, these are even better than Cold Mountain. And so I translated 300 poems of Han Shan and then 300 poems of Stonehouse. And these both men were hermits. And I wondered, do people like this really exist? Is this sort of just a fiction, fantasy? And so I wanted to go to China to find out. So I applied to the Guggenheim Foundation for a grant. And I thought, it's such a great idea, they've got to give me the money. And I was working at a radio station in Taiwan, English language radio station, and my job was to interview people who spoke English. And I was interviewing this man who was the son of the richest man in Taiwan. He was the head of the world's largest plastics company, Formosa Plastics, Winston Wong Win-Yang. And I asked him if he ever had seen the movie The Graduate. And he said, yeah, I've seen the movie The Graduate. So I said, well, what would you tell a graduate? He said, I would tell them to follow the Tao. And I was so impressed with that. I said, that's really impressive for somebody in your business. And so I thought I could confide with him. So I said, this might be one of my last interviews because I've applied to the Guggenheim for a grant to go find hermits in China. And he thought that was such a great idea. He said, if they don't give you the money, I will. And of course, they didn't, and he did. And so the slides I'm going to show you tonight is a result of that first trip I made to China in 1989. I'd been living in Taiwan 17 years, but I couldn't go to China because it would have gotten my wife into trouble. She was a Taiwan government employee, and Taiwan citizens were not allowed to go to China until '87. So in '89, I decided to go. And after Winston gave me the money, I had one more interview the next week before I could leave. I interviewed the man who became the president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, who was the head of the relations committee between the mainland and China. And I said, well, this is my last interview because I'm going to go to China to find hermits. He said, they don't even have any real monks or nuns in China, much less hermits. And so I had no idea if I was going to find people like Cold Mountain. I had no idea where to go. There's lots of mountains. Where the hermits are going to live? I had no idea. But I just happened to meet a monk in Beijing. And he said, I've heard some mountains, some monks, some hermits south of Xi'an. And so I went down south of Xi'an, hired a taxi, take me to the foot of the mountains, and said, pick me up in 2 days. And I walked into the mountains, and a couple hours later, I was writing down hermit addresses. Because it turns out there are mountains in China that are hermit mountains. I'd say 99% of all mountains in China are not hermit mountains, but there are certain mountains that are hermit mountains. It's where people go to practice. And so the slides I'm going to show you tonight sort of represent that tradition. It's hard to find an older tradition in China than the hermit tradition. The earliest bronzes we have, which go back over 3,000 years, have stories about hermits. These hermits have always been people who go into the mountains, spend a time alone, just like shamans used to do, eat some medicine maybe for visions, and they have a way of seeing things differently from their clan members, coming back down and helping people. So hermits are viewed as part of society, an important part of society, highly respected people, even today. And so without further ado, I'll just start showing you some slides, and we'll have a chance for some questions later. I'm not sure about the answers, but questions at least. I like to begin with this slide because it's nice to know where China came from. The key element in the development of Chinese civilization was the aridity of Central Asia, which was caused by the tectonic movements of plates, whereby the monsoons no longer reached Central Asia. It became dry, one of the driest places on the planet. And of course, as a result, it made water go either left or right. In the case of China, you can see all the rivers go down to the right. You can see the Yellow River here, the Yangtze here, and the West River right here. Well, the reason Chinese civilization did not develop along the Yangtze carries more water than any river in the world over the course of a year. Rains a lot, lots of trees, and you can't cut down trees without metal technology. Whereas the Yellow River, well, there were no trees. And the reason I say this is because in the next slide, this is the ocean coast in northern China in Neolithic times, 5500 BC. All of northern China doesn't exist. None of it. Beijing is in the ocean. Tianjin, of course, is in the ocean. And so the Yellow River is like this big mud fire hose that is just let loose. The world's second muddiest river is the Colorado. During the summer, silt content reaches between 5 and 10%. The Yellow River silt content in the summer reaches 50%. So this silt is deposited and raises, the river. It starts flooding and goes back and forth like a big fire hose. And all of northern China was filled in. But again, it's all mud. There's no mountains, there's no rocks, there's no trees. And so these Neolithic settlements were able to found the first cities along this incredible floodplain where they could irrigate with a stick. You could dig a canal and irrigate with a stick. And so Chinese civilization developed along that northern part of China, the Yellow River Basin. And where this arrow is where the first major civilized settlement began around 4000, 3000 BC. This is the city of Huaiyang. Anyway, this is the old moat of Huaiyang. You can see what a huge city it was. People were out digging that week. I guess it was a digging party. And the reason this was the first city in China is because this is the man who made it the first city in China, a man named Fu Xi. He was the man who designed the system of trigrams, you can see right down here, that formed the basis of the I Ching, and wrote the first version of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. And the Chinese consider him and his wife the Adam and Eve of Chinese civilization. And not only do they consider Fu Xi and his wife the Adam and Eve of the Chinese, Fu Xi and his wife are the Adam and Eve of almost everybody in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Because Fu Xi and his wife had different children, and they populated all these hill tribes too. All the minority groups in Southwest China are descended from Fu Xi. His wife is actually even more famous. We in the West have made her into a man. We call her Noah. But in East Asia, she's Niwa. She saved everybody from the Great Flood. At least she saved 2 children. and who floated away in a big gourd and so forth. So this is the first time when we begin to see the advent of Chinese civilization, Chinese religion also. Of course, this being the basis of Taoism, the beginnings of Taoism. And nowadays, the Chinese have sort of, forgotten about all this. Now it's all, the Tao they're interested in now is the Dow Jones. But if you go out to the countryside, sometimes you can find old shrines like this one right here, which is dedicated to Fuxi and Niwa. Very hard to find nowadays. There you see the statues of Fuxi and Niwa. You'll notice that they have horns, because the Chinese are the dragon race, consider themselves the dragon race, because Fuxi and Niwa were half human, half dragon. And anyway, they mark the real beginning of what we call Taoism in China, and civilization too. And about 600 years later, another man made the same town his capital. This is Shennong. Shennong means the god of agriculture. He was the one who identified which plants you could eat, which plants had medicinal values. And the place where he made his experiments was down along the Yangtze, not the Yellow, because the Yangtze doesn't have that many plants. So he went down to this area through the gorges, the Yangtze gorges, and this is the Shennong Jia Range, named after him today, where Shennong went up into these peaks and found plants. In fact, when I first started going to China interviewing old Taoists, I would ask them where the really old masters are, and they all said, they're in the Shennong Jia Range. And coincidentally, the Shennong Jia Range is also the range where all the sightings of the Chinese Yeti have been sighted. So it's just a bunch of long-haired Taoists, probably. So you can see how the Chinese civilization develops along the Yellow River, not the Yangtze. Again, too much water, too much trees, a lot of small ethnic groups here that don't get along. Anyway, you can see the different dynasties that begin here, all along different tributaries. The Fun River, the Wei River, and this is just a floodplain right here. So Huaiyang is pretty much where that red dot is, and that's where most of the early Taoists lived. And the early legendary emperors. This is Yu the Great, and Yao and Shun. People, again, emperors from the legendary period up to about 2000 BC, 2500 BC, something like that. So when we get to Chinese historical period, if we go back to Huaiyang here, just outside the town of Huaiyang, we get the beginnings of historical Taoism. You see these village women have come to this house where this famous Taoist lived. This is the house of Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching around 500 BC. This is Lao Tzu's old observatory. This right here. It's been rebuilt many times. This is, I think the guy on the right is the Taoist. And
who's the other guy?
I don't know. But anyway, the reason why, if any Taoist worth their salt would have an observatory where you can get above the ambient light and also above the dust, because nothing's paved in those days, and not only to observe stellar formations, but also clouds. The nature and colorations of clouds was equally important to the early Chinese astrologers and to Taoists. It's where the qi, where this energy is flowing. Basically, the Taoists see our Buddha, our body, as a microcosm of the greater cosmos. And sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on within us and how to deal with that by observing what's going on around us. And thus this intense observational study of clouds and stars and and having an observatory. So this is Lao Tzu's old town, old observatory, about 500 BC. Lao Tzu then went to Luoyang, got a job as the record keeper of the Zhou dynasty. And when he was in his 80s, he finally thought he'd had enough. And he left and headed west. He came to this place, the most strategic place in all of ancient China. It's called the Hangu Guan Pass. In ancient times, whoever held this pass controlled China. Even in the Second World War, the Japanese were unable to break through this pass. They had to fly around to get to Xi'an. And this is where Lao Tzu showed up one day, and the keeper of the pass was expecting him. He had seen some purple clouds coming his way, and he knew that was the advent of a sage. And so he asked him to write down his teachings. At least some people say he wrote them there. Others say he accompanied this gatekeeper to another place and wrote down the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu continued on from the pass to this mountain, Huashan. This has become a very famous Taoist mountain. It was already a Taoist mountain before Lao Tzu's day. You can see it. Huashan just means flower mountain, and it's just like a flower rising out of this foliage of stone. There you see one of the petals. And you walk up the spines of these things. You see the trail coming up the spine with little places where you can rest along the way. And then the Taoists live up here. They live on mountains like this because Taoists are especially interested in solitude because their meditations take a lot longer than the Buddhist meditations. Think of the Taoist meditation as that woman at the circus who gets all the plates spinning. That's a Taoist meditation. When you're developing different energy centers within your body and getting the qi flowing through all of them, it can take hours. Whereas a Buddhist meditation is just chanting the name of the Buddha, asking yourself, who's chanting the name of the Buddha? I don't think they would think that was a bad definition. Here you can see this girl is looking for this master, and it's 3,000 feet straight down. And she's walking on a couple of 2x4s, holding onto an iron chain. She's wearing loafers. She's got a purse around her neck. And he wasn't home. He had developed some arthritis because he had been on the mountain for 50 years. He was 85 when I met him. We're going to see him a couple slides later. These are the kind of caves where he was living and what she was looking for. This is a cave of a very famous Taoist woman who lived in the Han Dynasty. The Jade Maiden of the Bright Star, right here. Here you see a really high-class cave. It's overgrown, but it has a skylight. And post holes to hold eaves to keep out the rain. So somebody really, with some money, did that one. But these are the kind of places these plate spinners would seek out, where they could really be left alone for long periods of time. And anyway, this is on Huashan, very typical Taoist sanctuary of ancient times. This is the man she was looking for, a very famous Taoist master. He was 85 again when I took this photo of him. So Lao Tzu continued on from Huashan, past Xi'an, to this little mountain right here. These are the Zhongnan Mountains south of Xi'an, where I interviewed a bunch of hermits. We see there are the Zhongnan Mountains, and here's this loess soil, Chinese call it Huangtu, that blows down from Mongolia, can't get past the mountains, and so settles there. It's some of the deepest soil in the world. And on this particular, where I took this photo was where on that escarpment, they had found the jaw and skull cap of a human dated 1.3 million years. So people have been living in this area a long time, not necessarily hermits. We see an artist's rendition of the Zhongnan Mountains, and then there's this little knoll sticking out called Luoguantai. And right here, Luoguantai that's where Taoists believe Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching. around 500 BC. We see the earliest complete copy of the Tao Te Ching. This is dated around 200 BC, about 300 years after it was written. It was found in a tomb. We found partial copies dated 300 BC, but this is the earliest complete copy. You can see Lao Tzu's grave. This is his old school. Confucius is known as the great teacher in China because he's the first one who accepted students of all classes, not just the students of the elite. And he preferred to teach out of doors. So this is Apricot Pavilion where he used to teach, and just right next to it is his old home. It's been made into a huge shrine, and if you go behind that shrine, there's another shrine, and behind that another shrine and another shrine and another shrine. You have to walk over a kilometer till you get past all the shrines different emperors have built to Confucius. And they were all protected during the Cultural Revolution. Here's Confucius's grave in Qufu. Oddly enough, everybody in this town who has the surname Kung, which is Confucius's last name, has the right to be buried here too. So anyway, this is Confucius' grave, Xuansheng Mu, the grave of the exalted sage. Just outside of Qufu, we get the most sacred mountain in China, Taishan. This is where you go for reassignment to the afterlife. This is your spirit goes here if you're Chinese. These two shrine halls are 1,000 years old. The buildings are 1,000 years old. The inside, the murals are 1,000 years old, depicting an emperor making his procession to this mountain to pay his respects. Because in ancient China, you could not become the emperor unless you had paid your respects to Taishan. And so they would make the ascent. Behind the shrine, the trail begins. You see the beginning of the trail. It says the number 1 mountain, and it says Confucius climbed here. And that's a literal translation too. And so, because Confucius used to go to the mountains, all of these people who cultivated these paths would go to the mountains for solitude for certain periods. You see people going up this mountain, again, they're going up to honor their ancestors, to ask the gods to give their deceased loved ones a better rebirth. So they burn paper money, incense. It takes about 5 hours to get to the top. There are cable cars now, but you don't get as much merit. If you really want to help your loved ones, you have to walk. But there, you can see there's cold beer when you get to the top. And at the top, there's a shrine to the goddess of the mountain, Bixia Yuanjun, the jade maiden of the azure-colored clouds. Here's a Taoist priest in his blue robe. The Taoists love blue, whereas the Buddhists like yellow or brown, gray. And these men are examining a stele with an inscription of some emperor when he paid some money to have this place restored. So this is a Taoist shrine. All the sacred mountains in China are Taoist for the most part. So anyway, I wanted to introduce some of the background of the Confucian and Taoist traditions. The third tradition a spiritual tradition that came to China was the Buddhist tradition. We see how, taking these various paths from India through Pakistan, Afghanistan, through Kashgar, all the way up, wherever the sand, you could get through the sand, through Turfan, Hami, and Dunhuang. It was usually by camel. Nowadays, there's trains. They would go from Dunhuang through all the series of oases to wherever the Chinese capital was. Sometimes it was in Chang'an, or modern Xi'an. Sometimes it was in Luoyang. Around the time Buddhism arrived in China, Luoyang was the capital. We see the first Buddhists arriving in Luoyang were riding white horses, and so they built a temple for them called White Horse Temple. It's still there in Luoyang, about 2,000 years old. It's been, of course, rebuilt a few times. Just inside the front gate is the grave of the first translator, Matanga. And after he came here, though, the first thing he did after he translated this, he went to the mountains to spend some time in seclusion. We see a map of here's Luoyang, and he went up the Fun River Valley up to Wutaishan and started a retreat center at Wutaishan. This is in the 1st century AD. This is Wutaishan today. There's probably about 50 or 60 monasteries and nunneries there in this big valley. We see as Chinese history and religion developed, other centers developed, spiritual centers began. And one that is rather famous is called Zhouhuashan. Here's Shanghai over here. Zhouhuashan, 9-flower mountain. You can take a boat down the Yangtze and get off in Guichi and then take a bus to the foot of Zhouhuashan. This is Zhouhuashan in the distance. This is the old pilgrim trail. You see, as you get further up the pilgrim trail, there's stone steps. People leave locks along an iron chain to what shall I say, to symbolize the effort they're going through to come here. Because people who come to a sacred place do so to gain merit, not just for themselves, but to transfer that merit to a loved one. And so very often somebody will come here and say, I will be a vegetarian twice a month if my mother recovers from her illness, and this lock will rust away before I break my vow. And that's a very typical, or if I could pass the exams, I will, again, so if you go to Chinese restaurants on the new and full moon, you'll see a lot of people ordering vegetarian meals. So this is Zhouhuashan, the pilgrimage center. Lots of, dozens and dozens of monasteries and nunneries. They all come here to pay their respects to somebody who made the mountain sacred. In the Tang Dynasty, a Korean monk came here, and he was recognized as the incarnation of Ksitagarbha Bodhisattva, Ditsang Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva who is vowed to save all the beings in hell. And that's a lot of them, too. And because I'm sure there'd be people we'd want to exclude, but you see people selling incense and so forth, and they kept his body preserved in a big urn there. They give it a sponge bath once a year in private. But people come here to pay their respects, and this is what makes a sacred mountain. And thus, somebody made it sacred, so if you go there, you gain merit, and that you could then use like money in the bank. But right behind that shrine hall is this. Wilderness in China. So there are lots of mountain areas in China that are uninhabited. But this is not just uninhabited, there are lots of hermits in these mountains. A hermit woman I've been good friends with for about 30 years now, this woman named the Tiger Lady. This is her old hut right here. There she is coming out of the cave right there. Every time, the first 2 times I visited her, there were tiger footprints in her garden. And there was still, the South China tiger is about the size of a German Shepherd and was still common back in the 90s. Now, the last time I saw her alive, there were no longer any tiger footprints. But the place where I did all of my hermit work was the Zhongnan Mountains south of Xi'an, right here. There's a huge range right in here. But in the course of going into these mountains, I only interviewed about 50 or 60 hermits, but the other hermits estimated that there were about 200 hermits in this area. About 3 or 4 years ago, a Chinese film company asked me to come back to China and film me going back into the same range interviewing hermits. And the head of the film crew had read my book in Chinese and had taken it upon himself to visit all these hermits, and he said he had personally filmed over 600 in this area. So there are 3 times more hermits now than there was in 89 or 90. So this is Xi'an today. So it's a modern wall, only about 600 years old. The early Ming Dynasty wall goes around the entire city. This is south of Xi'an are the Zhongnan Mountains. I managed to fly out of the city on a clear day. And there's at least 50 to 100 hermits down there in this photograph. You see the one road going into the mountains, and so I would hire a taxi, ask them to take me as far as they could go, and then I would just start walking. Hermits have to live beyond the farmer commute. That is, farmers live, in the foothills too, and they will walk about an hour to a field, but not much more than an hour, just like we will to a job. So hermits have to live beyond that. And so if you want to find hermits, you have to go to the last villages and start walking about an hour. But because it's China, you're going to run into people. Here's some farmers coming down the mountain now, and they've been gathering walnuts. And they've been gathering walnuts from this hermit nun who planted them 10 years earlier, some trees that were starting to bear walnuts. And so when you meet people in China and you're looking for hermits, you ask them, 有没有修道的人? Is anybody cultivating the Tao on this mountain? And they know exactly what you're talking about. And they'll either take you there or they'll draw you a little map in the dirt. Here's a hermit now. And you can see how big the trail is. And he stopped just long enough to exchange a greeting and to point out where his hut is. He was out of food, was going down to the village at the bottom of the mountain to get some more wheat flour, and invited me up to his hut. There's his hut. And so they live in remote places. Again, beyond the farmer commute. Just on the other side of that ridge is the most famous hut in all of China. This was the hut used by Xu Lao, Xu Yun, Empty Cloud, the most famous Zen master of the last couple centuries in China. And in fact, this is where he got the name Empty Cloud back in 1903 when he was meditating here. But this has been fixed up since he was there. So these huts they're left vacant a lot. Sometimes you have to build your own, sometimes they're vacancies. Here we see in Hermit Realty a fixer-upper. It needs a lot of work, but it's got a lot of potential. You don't really need much of a roof because it's under an underhang. And there's a stream that comes right along here, so you got your water. So the two most important things, the two most important things for a hermit is water and firewood. And then, of course, the third most important thing is some land on which to grow stuff. And so each hermit has, in a sense, a territory whereby they gather firewood and look for patches of land that they can either make level or they've already been made a level by a previous hermit and then become overgrown. So sometimes you build your own hut. Now, this one has been made fresh. In fact, it's a brand new hut. It was made about 4 days ago. These bricks are made wet. You don't dry the brick. It's loess, L-O-E-S-S, loess, and straw. And you mix the stuff in a form, and as soon as you make it, you put on another one, and another one, and another one, because loess has such a cohesive property, you don't need the form anymore. And you just move the form up higher. And then once you put the roof on, then you build a fire for a couple of days, and you fire the hut. Turn the hut into a teapot, and put some windows in. And this is the nicest hut I've ever seen. It's going to have glass windows. It's got tiles on the roof. And the reason is, this is not your ordinary hermit. This is a hermit who's graduated from the Chinese literature department of Beijing University. And so he doesn't know how to do anything. And so he had to hire the farmers. He had to hire 8 farmers. It took them 6 days to build his hut. Cost him $100 to do it. And so the hermit tradition was not affected during the Cultural Revolution, because you knock down a hut, it springs right back up, $100. Anyway, he's become, since then, when I met him, he was just getting I tell people being a hermit is like getting your PhD. You spend 3 to 5 years after you've got a certain level of practice. And after he had just moved up here, and after he got his PhD, he since became one of the more famous Zen masters in China, the head of Dongshan, the mother temple of all Soto Zen in the world. The reason they're able to survive in the mountains is this thing right here, a kang, an oven bed. You see the hole where you put firewood, and it's a bunch of mud bricks, and there's a flue, of course, for the smoke to get out, and then you put a mat on top, and you do everything on your kang, so you don't have to waste energy heating air. You heat a single surface, just as if you had, some heat underneath your tiles or something. And so you eat on your kang, you sleep on your kang, you meditate on your kang, you entertain visitors. Most kangs are big enough for a couple people, so a visitor can spend the night. The hermits I've met are generally the happiest people I've ever met anywhere, but not this woman. But that's because she had just spent her first winter, and the villagers weren't too sure about her, and the villagers really won't help you until you've spent that first winter, and you can see her roof, and look at plastic over her windows. She was almost in tears when I interviewed her. I came back about a year or two later, and she had a tiled roof, glass windows. She was smiling. She was so happy because people were helping her. So again, hermits are highly respected if they're really hermits. Now there's your typical hermit smile. She spent 35 years in this hut, and most famous master in the mountains, Huiyuan. And last time I saw her alive, there were 6 Communist Party officials in her hut. They had all heard about her and wanted to know what they could do to help her. And this young nun, she was a college student who had gone hiking with her friends one day and ran into her hut, met her, was so impressed she told her friends to go back down without her. And she's been on the mountain ever since, and now she is the most famous teacher in the Zhongnan Mountains. I really would like to wish she would lighten up a little. She hasn't gotten the smile of her teacher down. But she's just a wonderful person. Anyway, that's Chen Bo Fasher. And here's a hermit tea party. So it's not an ascetic life. You try to gain your pleasures wherever you can. This is down in South China. You see a different kind of roof. And here, they get so much rainfall down here, this hermit is actually growing his own rice. So the 4 things a hermit needs is a staple, either rice or wheat flour, salt, cooking oil, and kerosene. The salt is really important to preserve vegetables for the winter. If you can get those things, then you're fine. And you need about $10 a month to get those things. And usually you'll have a relative who comes by once a year, a friend, a passerby like me, maybe a disciple. After my book was translated into Chinese, Road to Heaven was translated into Chinese, it sold 250,000 copies and resulted in the formation of a hermit association, whereby this very wealthy Chinese businessman in Hong Kong donates enough money every year to give hermits $100 every year, so they can get their salt, or cooking oil, and a staple, and so forth. The only problem is they have to go down the mountain and register. And I've talked to the association people about that, but yeah, what are you going to do? It's an organization. Hermits also played a major role in the literary life of China. That is, a lot of them were poets, and so these mountains north of Luoyang are called the Taihang Mountains, and it's the scene of one of the most famous groups of meditators, drinkers, and poets in Chinese history, around the year 200 or so. This is where the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove lived. Zhulin Qixuan lived here. And the most famous member of them was a poet named Ranji, who wrote a series of poems called Poems from the Heart. And in this poem, he talks about visiting a mythical, going back to the old capital that had been destroyed. And he was living in Luoyang, where Lao Tzu also was the record keeper. And so he talks about that, and he talks about these mountains. 平生少年时，轻薄好仙儿，西游咸阳中，照理想经过。娱乐为终极，白日胡恰托。驱马扶来归，翻谷望山河。黄金白金，则用长苦多。北岭太行道，是路长如河。You know, these poems used to be rhymed. The language has changed, though. Sometimes you hear it, sometimes you don't. Those early years, and of course, the Chinese have never read their poetry. They've always sung it until modern times. Well, I was fortunate to have one of the most famous, if not the most famous, calligraphy teacher in Taiwan as my calligraphy teacher. I'd go to the Palace Museum in Taiwan once a week, and he would teach me calligraphy, or try to. And I asked him one day, I said, I hear that the Chinese people don't really read poems, that you sing them. He said, yeah. I said, well, there's nothing in the characters to indicate, tones and, musical elements. How do you sing them? He said, just wait a minute. And he went into another room and came back out, and he put down on the table a bottle of whiskey. So I'm trying to get in the mood. He said, it's sort of like, that Ratatouille, right? Anyone can cook. Well, anybody can sing Chinese poems. Those early years of my life, I indulged in music and song. I traveled west to ancient Xianyang, where I met the rich and the famous. But before the revelry ended, suddenly the sun slipped away. I spurred my horse and headed home and gazed on the rivers of Luoyang again. Having squandered a fortune of gold, I was pressed to meet even simple expenses. To the north stretched the road to Taihang, but not for someone as lost as me. Well, eventually he made it to Taihang and became this incredibly famous poet, one of the leaders of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove. About 400 AD, we see what I would say is every ancient Chinese poet's favorite poet, and definitely my favorite poet. That's the old village where he lived. His name is Tao Yuanming, and the mountain is Lushan on a rare, clear day. The last time I visited, I visited his village 5 times. The last time I visited his village, he lived here 400 AD. The last time I visited his village, when the huts were still there, before they were bulldozed, which was only, 10 years ago, the week before I visited, his last lineal male descendant had died. Anyway, this is Tao Yuanming, everybody's favorite poet. And this is number 5 of his drinking poems. He served as an official briefly and said, screw this, and built a hut. But instead of building it on the mountain, he built it close to farmers. 戒律在人境，如车马喧。问君何能儿，心远地则偏。在居东篱下，悠然见南山。山气日夕乍，飞鸟相与还。则中有真意，语变以妄言。I built my hut beside a path, but I hear neither cart nor horse. You ask, how can this be? When the mind travels, so does the place. Picking chrysanthemums by the eastern fence, I lose myself in the southern hills, the mountain air, the sunset light, birds flying home together. In this there is a truth I'd explain if I could remember the words. We go out to the countryside in our little trusty three-wheeler. We discover, Cold Mountain's Cave. Cold Mountain's Cave. So here's some poems by Cold Mountain. In this poem, he refers to a very famous story back where about 4,500 years ago, the emperor tried to give his throne to a hermit, a man named Xiao. And Xiao was so annoyed at this, he went down to the stream and washed out his ears to get rid of any sound of that request. And so, this is Cold Mountain's poem. 出生30年，长有千万里，新疆青草河，如塞红尘起。连鸟空秋闲，读书见勇士。今日归寒山，真有见喜儿。Born 30 years ago, I've traveled countless miles along rivers where the green rushes swayed, to the frontier where the red dust swirled. I've made elixirs and tried to become immortal. I've read the classics and written odes, and now I've retired to Cold Mountain to lie in a stream and wash out my ears. And here's another one by Cold Mountain. 人问寒山道，寒山路不通。夏天并未时，日出雾朦胧。似我何有解，与君心不同。君心若似我，还得道其中。People ask the way to Cold Mountain, but roads don't reach Cold Mountain. In summer, the ice doesn't melt. Sunny days, the fog is too dense. So how did someone like me arrive? Our minds are not the same. If they were the same, you would be here. You can see another view of the cave with a hut inside, a hut that doesn't need a roof because it uses the roof of the cave. There's a woman been living in there for many years. She's taken a vow of silence. I call her the butterfly woman because she flits around. I think she used to be an opera singer. It's my theory. We see, this is the last slide I have. This is my favorite place because it's the old hut of Stonehouse, a monk who I sort of discovered, lived in the early 14th century. And where a couple of years ago, looking for his grave, I broke my ankle. So I have a very personal relationship with him, and I have a bone to pick. And also some steel plates and some screws. So he was asked by his disciples when he was very old to write down his thoughts, and he wrote down this book of poems called Mountain Poems. I don't know if any of you have ever read any books by John Blofeld. It's a man who wrote books about Buddhism and Taoism back in the 60s and 70s. And when I visited John in his retreat in Bangkok, part of this line, the last line, was on his garden gate. Biao Tiendi, there's another realm. A very famous line. There's another realm beyond the world of man. Here's a poem by Jia Dao, a monk who became a poet after he became a monk. This is looking for a recluse and finding him gone. 松下问童子，言是在遥去，只在这山中，云深不知处。Below the pines, I ask the boy. He says his master has gone to find herbs. He's somewhere on this mountain, but the clouds are too thick to know where. And finally, one last poem by Wang Wei. Some of you may have heard of Wang Wei, another 8th century Tang Dynasty poet. And One of the customs that where it was common, beginning around the year 200, because Ranji used to, the man who was a member of the seven sages of the Bamboo Grove, used to do this Taoist practice of generating amounts of qi and making this droning sound. Nowadays, you can hear something reminiscent in the Tuvan Mongol singers, the throat singers. Have you heard that? Well, that's sort of a song version of what these Taoists were doing 1,000 years ago. I've tried to get Taoists to explain to me how they do it, but either nobody knows how or nobody will tell. I mean, it's different from the Tuvan singing. But so they would drone, and they would build towers. They would build towers, and then you could hear it for miles when they would drone, when they generate this qi from their bellies and then send it out. So this is Wang Wei's Bamboo Retreat. Incidentally, a very interesting place, because his retreat is in one of the most beautiful places in the Zhongnan Mountains, and it's a nuclear weapons factory. Each time I've gone there, I've had to deal with the authorities, as you can imagine. But anyway, this is his old retreat. It's in the Zhongnan Mountains, beautiful place. Here's his poem. Du cuo you huang li, tan qin fu chang xiao, shen lin ren bu zhi, ming yue lai xiang zhao. Sitting alone amid dense bamboo, playing my zither and droning, deep in the forest no one else knows, until the bright moon looks down. Well, that's all the material I have. I thought now maybe we could have some questions, and I would consider answering some of them. Oh yeah, sure.
That's great. Really great. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.